안녕하세요. JNCTV 현송 기자입니다. 2020년 북미관계, 남북관계 전망이라는 주제로 웨비나를 진행할 예정인데요. 웨비나는 영어로 진행하고 질문은 영어와 한국어로 두 개로 자유롭게 하실 수 있습니다. Hello everyone, my name is Hyun-song and I'm a reporter at JNCTV. So today, Tim and Simone will give the 10-minute lecture, and the title is that US and the DPRK relations and the Korean Peninsula. So first, I'll introduce Simone, and Simone will introduce Tim, and our lecture will start. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Simone Chun. Simone received a PhD in the political science from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and now she is the professor at the Northeastern University. Simone is one of the best Korea experts in the United States, and also she's an activist. As you know, she used to collect the signature from Professor Noam Chomsky to save and help the Korean labor workers.
Thank you very much, Hyun, and thank you so much for JNC TV for this initiative. Let me first also introduce our speaker, Tim Shorrock, and I don't think I need a lot of big introduction because Tim is well known. He is a Washington-based journalist, and Tim grew up in Japan and South Korea, where Tim's parents worked as missionaries and relief workers after World War II and the Korean War. And he's well known and also in South Korea for revealing in 1996 the secret background role played by the Carter administration in the Korean military's violent suppression of the Gwangju citizens' uprising in 1980. For the past 20 years, Tim has been a correspondent for The Nation, one of the most esteemed progressive magazine in the United States and also worldwide, and has been closely covering the Korean peace process involving the United States. And Tim has been writing extensively for the News Tapa in Korea, the Korean Center for Investigative Journalism. And in 2015, Tim was named an honorary citizen of the city of Gwangju in recognition of his stories about the 1980 uprising. So it is a truly honor to be with the team for today's webinar.
Thank you.
Let me first share my slides. Let's see. So the goal of my brief talk will be to think about framework, to think of the relationship between United States and DPRK. And I want to think about how we can move away from hostile relationship to the creating moment for diplomacy and also creating peace regime. So this is just a brief outline. First, I want to talk about maybe 3 scenarios of US-DPRK relations. Those are military escalation, the status quo, and the third scenario will be diplomacy, negotiation, and creating new peace regime. And secondly, I will look at the 3 factors that I looked at that shaped a recent US-DPRK relations, which means under Trump administration. And those are inter-Korean engagement, and secondly, structural changes, which I refer to as North Korea is now developing its completed nuclear program. So right now, the relationship between the United States and North Korea is a relationship between 2 nuclear weapon states. One is a nuclear weapon state, United States, and the other being quasi-nuclear weapon state. And I argue that that is a sort of game changer that has fundamentally changed the relationship between North Korea, United States, and DPRK. And third, I think the peace movement had a lot to do with shaping the current US-DPRK relations. And then I'll conclude with how we can get out of this current impasse. So let's look at the 3 scenarios. Those are the first, the military escalation, meaning there's a military clash, some kind of even the collapse of North Korea and leading to the worst possible outcome, which we want to avoid. Second is more the status quo. That means the oscillation between conflict and cooperation, which has been the predominant pattern of the US-DPRK relations. And third is diplomacy, negotiation, and a new peace regime, which is, I consider, more desirable. So let's look at this more sort of macro view, chronology of the United States and North Korea since 1945. We don't need to go to every single detail. One thing I want to point out is the 1953, look at it, an armistice is signed and the Washington imposes sanction on Pyongyang. There's not a full-fledged peace treaty has been signed when the war was halted. And I argue that this has been the underlying factor of the potential military escalation, which is still exists. And so if you look at no matter which way you look at it, that condition has never changed. So when I look at the first scenario, military escalation, the underlying factor, the first main cause is basically unending Korean War, which then look at another one looking at global nuclear weapons regime. As you can see, 90% of nuclear warheads belong to Russia and the United States. And as if you look at the map there, North Korea has about 30 nuclear warheads, depending on the estimate. So which basically is being the source of military escalation. And on the Korean Peninsula in particular, as you know, the United States introduced nuclear weapons to the peninsula first. And South Korea had been the largest overseas US nuclear bases until early 1990s. And that, moreover, another factor of a military escalation is obviously Korea being third largest importer of US weapons. All these adding up to basically still creating a potential for military escalation. But military escalation, the war did not reoccur since 1953. One reason being obviously any war on the Korean Peninsula, as you know, will have, depending on the calculation, even conventional weapon war will kill about 300,000 some people. And also if nuclear war, we're talking about some 25 million casualties, which is explained the second reason why we are here. The US-DPRK relationship is basically the status quo from oscillation between conflict and cooperation, which you can see some of those previous nuclear negotiation. Now, another way of looking at the nuclear US-DPRK relationship is in this chart. Now, what do we see? What do you make out of this US-DPRK relationship? This is the graph that is based on my own research. It is a time series analysis, which I did with the help of my graduate student. Between 2000 and 2008, we gathered all the interactions between United States and DPRK. And then we coded, right? 0 means the worst conflict. The highest was actually measured 5, which would mean the highest level of cooperation. So the pattern that you have is something like this, ups and down, ups and down, ups and down, right? And what it shows the repeated failure of any negotiation. And if you look at it, this is the US, North Korea and South Korea, you will see similar pattern. What it shows is that the interrelationship between US-DPRK and also inter-Korean relations. So which is pretty abnormal. If any country that has ups and downs like that, you would think that this is, it's a madness. It's abnormality. And I put another one that is US, North Korea, and China. So this should be normal, right? So this tried to show it as a contrast. The next scenario I want to look at is a possibility of a breakthrough, diplomacy, and negotiation, possibly leading to creating a peace regime. Now, here I'm looking at, for my own work, I want to look at 3 variables. That is inter-Korean engagement, second, fundamental structural changes, and third, peace movement. Let's look at briefly, how did all this, the latest inter-Korean engagement happen? I argue that this has to do with candlelight revolution, which we all now familiar. We're also involved with, which led to the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics of inter-Korean cooperation, and then leading to a series of the Panmunjom Declaration, and you also have this sort of the explosion of the inter-Korean engagement during the last year and a half. And as you can see, this is the poll among South Koreans, has a very favorably, close to 90% of South Koreans looked at inter-Korean relationship as favorably. So this is, again, shows, right, sort of popular support, what this inter-Korean engagement has brought. And we have more images of the inter-Korean engagement. And this is a picture that I took when I went to Korea. The KTX, imagine Seoul, Pyongyang, Paris. One day we'll have a KTX going all the way to Europe if Korea unified. And beautiful picture of a city and Seoul Plaza about the unified Korea. And the point that I'm making here is that what did the inter-Korean engagement did? It really shows that domestic South Korean politics matters and peace on the Korean Peninsula. And also it means the importance of Koreans taking control of their own destiny. That is, it's up to 80 million Koreans who need to shape this peace. And thirdly, I think it's important is still the United States has been continually, as somewhat kind of almost sabotaging of this inter-Korean cooperation. And the next one, I want to show you the picture of, obviously, the next one looking at the summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un. As a lot of people think, how does this happen? I think this happened in part because, let's look at, it's because of the peace movement and the great work of peace activists, which really not enough attention has been made. You don't see it in the mainstream yet, which is why I want to talk about it. When we say peace movement, what are you talking about? These diverse groups of peace activists who have worked for years and years, some people all their life, and culminating, now bringing together for the last year and a half and creating this incredible momentum. Women Cross DMZ and the Korea Peace Now and Veterans for Peace, including people like great journalists like Team Shorrock. And so what these peace activists have been able to do was something that the previous movement couldn't. Bringing in 4 issues. One is about the issues that the mainstream media neglect. That is this harsh economic effect of economic sanctions on North Korea. So as you can, this one slide you will see, I didn't even include the sanctions after 2017. It's increase of sanctions. And also if you look at more detail, but sanctions really is hurting North Korea's civilian economy. This is about warfare against the entire population of North Korea, right? For the actions made by the government. So, and also another thing you can also get from the sanction, which also activists have brought, is this is excellent latest publication research by Korea Peace Now and the Women Cross DMZ. If you look at the kind of some of the few items that are banned by US sanctions, look at paper clips, scissors and staplers. You cannot send those North Korea because this somehow will be used to produce nuclear weapons. So it's fairly absurd. Now, and as you can also see how sanctions impact the people in North Korea who have nothing to do with the actions of the government. And again, going back to idea, what these peace activists have been able to do, how the impact of a sanction that hinder urgently needed humanitarian efforts, it exacerbates pre-existing food and basic service shortages, and hampered and degrade already limited medical care in North Korea and harm the most vulnerable members of its population. So to almost conclude, I also wanted to another one that peace activists, peace movement have been able to do. If you look at this, some of the issues that American President North Korea have engaged, one thing that is missing you can see about the peace treaty, right? No mention of peace treaty, which is another accomplishment by the work of peace activists. Why do we need a peace treaty? Among many reasons, and you can get some of those reasons from the Korea Peace Now, that there's great resources. One thing that I would like to emphasize here is that peace treaty ending the war on the Korean Peninsula will also, right, prevent any catastrophic global economic consequence. Suppose if there's a war happen on the Korean Peninsula, imagine currently right now, coronavirus already having some economic consequences. Imagine the war that killed 200, 300,000 people, what kind of impact that will have. So finally, if you look at this, another accomplishment that the peace movement has done was increase the support for peace agreement with North Korea among Americans. And to conclude, this is the picture again shows that how the peace activist work has raised awareness for the importance of a peace treaty. To conclude, I'm thinking of, we are going back to my first point, we are at an impasse. So how can you get out of this impasse? this is some of the policy recommendations recommended by many. A, implement partial sanction relief. Second, declare an end to the Korean War. And third, open liaison offices in Washington and Pyongyang. In fact, I think the third one should be pretty easy. It doesn't involve Congress, and it should be the important step to made. So to conclude, I would like to stress the importance of all the works that peace activists have done, and the goal will be to move away from the hostile relationship and to possibly to this. I'm showing what you're seeing in the screen is the very popular latest drama showing and available in Netflix. It's called Crash Landing on You. It's the love affair between South Korean woman and a very handsome North Korean soldier. And although it's fantasy, I think it is possible someday when the peace is created and also unified. And lastly, I would like to thank for this opportunity. And also, I would like to, going back to the most important point that I want to think about, although this was not the focal point of this presentation, the most important one for peace on the Korean Peninsula will up to us, up to North and South Koreans, 80 million. And I'm sharing this picture that I took when I was in Korea during the summit, Inter-Korean Summit. There's a huge banner hung on the City Hall. And I salute for, and I wish that we finally end the Korean War and for peace. Thank you, and I will pause here. I hope I didn't go too long. It looks like I did, and my apology. And let's go to Team Shorrock.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for this opportunity to do this webinar. And I thank you, Simone, for your long view of the situation. I don't have any slides, so just maybe listen along, and I'll continue. So I'm just going to talk about where we are now, and what the situation is between the U.S. and North Korea, and then sort of the main forces at work in Washington that could influence what happens in the future, short term and long term. So sort of picking up on where Simone left off, right now, well, since the Hanoi summit where Trump met Kim Jong-un for the second time about a year ago in Hanoi, those talks failed, as you know, and there's been a standoff over the two sides' positions, and the U.S. position has been there should be in these negotiations, the U.S. endpoint. The U.S. seeks the denuclearization of North Korea, disarmament of North Korea. But the U.S. position is there should be no, giving up any sanctions whatsoever until Kim Jong-un agrees to give up all of his nuclear weapons and delivery systems. And that's pretty much the line of the Trump administration through these talks so far. And North Korea has made some offers to give up portions of their nuclear industry and their nuclear force in exchange for certain kinds of lifting of sanctions, but that was rejected by the Trump administration in Hanoi. So the North Koreans always say, what do they want? They want what they say is an end to the hostile policy of the United States. They say this over and over and over again, and they've been saying it for years. Hostile policy, and sometimes it's hard to really figure out what they mean by that. But a few months ago, Moon Jae-in, who is a key advisor to the President Moon of South Korea, he was here in Washington, and he gave a press conference, and I asked him if he could summarize what the North Koreans mean by end of hostile policy. And his Moon is a good source because he has met with the North Koreans many times and understands their position pretty well. But one is, of course, the elimination of sanctions. For them, that's the most important indicator of the hostile policy of the United States. And as you can see from one of her slides, Simone's slides, the first sanctions were imposed in 1953. So basically there's been an embargo on trade with North Korea for all that time. The second would be, normalized relations. North Korea has been looking for normal relations with the United States, to not necessarily friendly, but normal. So we're not enemies anymore. So they want diplomatic ties. They want liaison offices, embassies in each other's capital. That would be a very important indicator of an end to hostile policy. On the military side, the North Koreans would like a non-aggression treaty, a lasting peace treaty to end the Korean War, suspending, joint military exercises and training with South Korea, and not deploying strategic weapons on the Korean Peninsula. Strategic weapons meaning, like B-52s that can carry nuclear weapons, that can carry those kind of weapons. They want to have no more of that around Korea. And finally, the North would really like to have a normal, be a normal nation in the trading system. And they would like the US to help it become a member of the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, let South Korea North Korea engage in normal trade with the world. And it goes along with ending the sanctions, but that's what they mean by the hostile policy. They want all this lifted, and they want the threat against them, the nuclear threat, which they feel surrounds them in the US military forces in the Asia Pacific area. They want that, diminished and changed. So it's not a threat against them, and they don't have to fear for the US attacking them or something. And so they've been locked in these, the standoff, for months now, and there's been really no movement on their positions on either side. But as I recently wrote in The Nation magazine, there is some cracks beginning to appear, from the hardline proponents of U.S. hardliners here in Washington that support the maximum pressure campaign, and there's cracks between them and the Trump administration. And some of these divisions are because even some of the conservative groups here are unhappy that Trump administration is demanding South Korea pay, like 5 times more for the privilege of having U.S. bases there. They want billions more from from South Korea. But I think the most important shift that I see among these hardliners is to have, I've heard people say, well, maybe some of the sanctions should be lifted. Like, for example, the sanctions that were imposed on North Korea in 2017 by the United Nations Security Council, those are some of the most damaging right now, because it stops them from exporting coal, for example, which is a big export for them, big revenue producer. It's cut them off from oil. The UN sanctions have forced North Korean workers who work in other countries to come back to North Korea. And so there's some people are saying that the U.S. should agree to some relaxation of maybe the UN sanctions, and then in return, North Korea would give up a certain number of its nuclear weapons, or agree to get rid of a certain number of their weapons. There'd be a concession on each side. And the fact that these hardliners are talking about this right now is very significant, I think, because it shows that they're very concerned that the situation could go back into a escalation again, like a dangerous situation like in 2017. And so I'm just going to turn to who is who kind of in Washington, like all these who is the hardliners, and who are the sort of more maybe want to have a more flexible policy. And so I group them into different groups. Like on one hand you have what I call military industrial think tanks. These are think tanks that are funded by defense contractors and military contractors, and that, you know, push for a very sort of more robust, you know, military policy on the part of the United States. Groups like the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Brookings Institution, the Hudson Institute, Heritage Foundation. You know, people from these organizations are always on TV. You always see them on CNN. You always see them on MSNBC. Many of them are former CIA officers and analysts, and they, you know, they tend to have this, you know, take this very hardline view, and also, like, Center for Strategic and International Studies has been, you know, ever since Trump met Kim in Singapore in 2018, they've been, you know, putting out imagery and sort of working with the New York Times and other newspapers to get stories out about how North Korea is still developing its nuclear weapons and still developing its defense capability. And, you know, I mean, they're still developing their deterrence capability, and they still are, you know, they haven't tested any nuclear weapons, they haven't tested any long-range rockets, but there is no agreement for them to do anything. Just as there is still no agreement for the US to do anything. So it's kind of a false story, I think, that they promote, because until there's an agreement, it's basically status quo. I mean, North Korea feels it has to create a deterrence, and the US feels it also maintains its deterrence capability against North Korea. So, you know, CSIS has been very, you know, very out there talking about how North Korea is, like, even cheating on Trump and is in violation of the agreement in Singapore, but there really was no agreement there. So where does the Pentagon stand on this? Interestingly, over the last few years, in talking to lots of people in the military and following what they say, that, you know, I don't see the Pentagon as a hardline player in this. You know, they have, you know, we have 28,500 troops in South Korea. The U.S. does, and a very huge military base. The largest in the world is in South Korea now. But they're not, the Pentagon itself is not really a driver, you know, for war, or they're more like have been a voice against military escalation on the Korean Peninsula, like keeping it where it is, not escalating. And partly that's through, you know, the U.S. military has the U.S. Forces Korea, but there, you know, as you know, the Korean War was fought under the UN command, which was formed by the United Nations, but the U.S. completely runs the UN command. It's not really a UN command, it's really a US command, but it's in name only. And in fact, the UN commander is the top general who commands US forces in Korea. And the UN command actually reports to the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon. So it's part of the US, it's part of the US military. And over the last, you know, Simone talked about some of the steps that South Korea and North Korea have taken since they had the summit with Kim and Moon in September 2018. And the most important thing they did was de-escalate the military situation on the border at the DMZ, where they took down guard posts and they removed lots of mines, and you know, people aren't carrying the same kind of weapons they had before. It's a much different situation on the DMZ. You don't hear about this at all, but it was accomplished because the UN command negotiated with the North Korean military and the South Korean military, you know, at the triangular table. One side is the UN command, North Korea here, South Korea here. So, you know, they can play a kind of role in reducing tensions a little bit in that sense. And so they're not really, you know, I think they're, you know, the Pentagon, you know, wants to maintain a huge force in the Pacific, but they're cognizant of the importance of South Korea as a military ally, and you know, they want to work with them. I think the South Korean military. And then, you know, another force in Washington is, you know, the neocons, people that really want to overthrow North Korea, want to have regime change. And, you know, some of them kind of use the issue of human rights in North Korea as a weapon and try to, you know, they work with defectors, and they hope to have some kind of, you know, North Korean, you know, some kind of uprising in North Korea led by pro-US defectors, basically. But they're a pretty strong force here in Washington, and you hear, you know, a lot of people, I think, would like rather see North Korea crushed and you know, defeated and you know, turned into like some kind of version of South Korea, rather than exist as North Korea. And you still have that kind of, you know, those groups here in Washington. And then, you know, finally, of course, you know, we have the peace movement and engagement forces. You know, the peace movement on Korea, you know, outside of Korea, I'm talking about here, you know, really started from Korean Americans during the 80s, going to North Korea for the first, visiting their family members in North Korea for the first time. And, you know, the Korean families living overseas that have divided families, that have, you know, Koreans inside Korea that have family in North Korea, Koreans outside have divided families. And, you know, so you have to keep, you know, ending the division and finding ways to engage with North Korea is very important to, you know, many Koreans and Korean Americans. You have, you know, Women Cross DMZ and Christine Ahn, you know, who actually, you know, has organized an incredible movement of women peacemakers to try to really push the peace process in Korea. You know, they crossed the DMZ a few years ago in a march, and they got the attention of, you know, North Korea, South Korean government, and the U.S. military, and they've been a very powerful force, and a lot of peace movements are joining with them and calling for a peace agreement to end the war, end the state of war in Korea. And, you know, we have pro-engagement, you know, humanitarian organizations like the American Friends Service Committee, the Mennonites, and others that have programs in North Korea, you know, trying to help basic needs of Korean people in North Korea, and all these forces are starting to get some traction in Washington. I think, you know, you have, you know, I mean, of all the presidential candidates, the one that's really been listening to the peace movement is Bernie Sanders, and I give him a lot of credit for actually, you know, changing his positions. You know, the peace movement has been meeting with, you know, I mean, they've had meetings with Trump's chief negotiator, Stephen Biegun, who's the #2 person at the State Department now. I mean, they've really, you know, people are really listening to them. And I think they're starting to get traction in Congress. And, you know, ending the state of war in Korea, to me, is the most important step that can be taken. Because if there's a peace agreement, then you know, that would, because right now it's an armistice. It's just, you know, putting your arms down, right? Ending the shooting. But there's still a state of war. And if there's a peace agreement, then steps can be taken, you know, to move forward and, you know, change the relationship between North and South Korea, and maybe eventually under, you know, a peace regime, North Korea would eventually give up its nuclear weapons. You know, but that will not happen if they feel if there's no peace and if they feel threatened by the United States. So I think that it's really, that's why, you know, I think the peace movement and the steps it's taken in recent years is so important. And the last thing I want to say is, you know, I think the idea that the U.S. would, you know, do a preemptive strike on North Korea to take out its nuclear weapons industry or system. A lot of people used to talk about that, you know, in public, and John Bolton was a big proponent of that. But you don't really hear that much anymore, because they know that a war, and, you know, people at the Pentagon really know this. If there is a war, if the U.S. attacked North Korea, a war would begin right away, and that could kill millions of people within a few days. Seoul is a huge city, one of the biggest cities in the world, and it's only 30 miles or so from the border, from the DMZ, and Seoul could be pummeled in the first 48 hours of a war. So that the war is unthinkable, I think, and it's beginning to occur to people here that because the war is unthinkable, there is no military solution. There has to be a negotiated peace process, and I think that's where we're moving toward. And I am actually kind of hopeful that there's enough going on to sort of keep pushing that idea. So that's where I'll end, and I'm sure we'll be happy to take questions. Thank you.
I appreciate the fact that both the speakers were very helpful. I have a question. Some of my friends who have been in contact with Stephen Begin have said that the U.S. is very open to negotiations at this point. He's been trying hard to meet with the North Koreans, traveled to South Korea and China, hoping that they would respond to him, and that the North Koreans are not responding at all. Do either of you have any insights on that?
You know what, actually, I'll defer to maybe Tim. My understanding is that North Korea was not, felt that Stephen Biegun did not bring any new to the table. And that was why that the last attempt failed. So, but on the other hand, though, I'm not sure if it's true that from Korean politicians, they said there's going to be some kind of engagement, major breakthrough very soon. One source says that even in March or in a couple of months. So I'm not quite sure about the details. So what I know is actually the Stephen Biegun did not really bring anything new. That's why North Korea was not really moving forward with the last talk that they had. So I'm not sure if the team has more detail to that.
I should say that informally I've been hearing through my friend who does communicate with him that the U.S. is ready to talk peace treaty. The U.S. is ready to talk a longer term for negotiations on nuclear issues and even lifting some sanctions. It seems like the U.S. is at the place where the North Koreans were back at the Hanoi summit when Bolton crashed everything. At least if the indications that I'm hearing indirectly from the State Department are true, it seems like they're there and the North Koreans have not been responding.
Doug, I think you're correct, and I think I've been hearing the same thing from people, and I've gone to, just this week everything has been shut down in D.C. because of the coronavirus. But the previous 2 weeks there was some seminars I went to, and there was one where I actually heard Alex Wong speak. Alex Wong is the new chief negotiator for the U.S. with the DPRK. And he's still in the confirmation process. And so he hadn't been confirmed, but he spoke at this one event and he didn't say much, but he said, basically, the door has been opened, they don't want to talk. And I think it's, very clear that Simone is correct. The reason they're not accepting invitations to talk is because they want to hear something that's different than they've heard in the past, like, some kind of move on sanctions, something, because lifting sanctions is a really critical issue, I think. And so they want to hear a proposal that would, move them toward, a peace agreement, but step by step, and they're willing to make some concession in return for some sanctions and move that way. So that's why I think what I've been writing about, these sort of hardliners sort of making proposals on lifting like the UN sanctions are important, because these are people that, meet with the Trump administration, a lot. And, I think the Trump National Security Council draws on these people for advice. But also like, there was a recent statement that I think I quoted in my last article from the top Pentagon official, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, I think, who said, a peace treaty would be good. And going on record as a U.S. military official saying, a peace treaty would be a positive thing. So, and I also heard Alex Wong, and at the talk he gave, sort of use similar language, saying that would be a good thing for Korea and a good thing for the peace process. So I think there is some thinking along these lines. It's just whether that can happen. The North Koreans are they're really solidifying their defense capabilities now with their deterrence capabilities against this array of military bases that the U.S. has around the Korean Peninsula. And they're going to, and I think, Kim Jong-un has made it clear that if the U.S. doesn't give up on sanctions, lifting sanctions, they're just going to do what they can to get by and possibly, move closer to China and Russia, with, get some support from China and importing certain things and being able to trade a bit. They will try to make it if the U.S. won't do it. So I think they're looking for a sign that the U.S. is actually willing to move beyond what it was willing to do at Hanoi.
And what I'm hearing indirectly is that the U.S. is willing to move, and that the North Koreans aren't negotiating at all with them.
Yeah. Well, I would say right now they're probably dealing just like we are with this coronavirus, and it's really dangerous for them because, so much, like they could really be crushed because their medical system is in such terrible shape, as you know, that, any kind of, outbreak would be really terrible for them. So, but, they weren't talking before this. So, I think they are looking for some kind of dramatic, change in position being announced by Trump or something, and they still haven't given up on Trump making a deal with them. Like they don't, they might criticize Moon Jae-in, they might criticize the U.S. as a whole, they might criticize certain U.S. officials like John Bolton or presidential candidates like Joe Biden, but they certainly don't criticize Trump right now, the North Koreans I'm talking about. So I think they're waiting for some kind of sign from him.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think recently Professor Kim Jin-hyun, he made a suggestion that maybe we can reopen Kaesong complex and they can make a mask for coronavirus. I mean, maybe this can be a good, how would you say, game changer, but not a big game changer, but maybe somehow it can be, open door for the talks or anything. So what do you think? Do you think it's realistic enough, or?
So can I respond to that? And also I'll add to that, I think probably all of us think that's a great idea. Kaesong Industrial Complex, which has really, closed down by Park Geun-hye, right? The impeached, who are right now serving in the prison. And, some people really critical of President Moon Jae-in, because this is something that he could have pushed up more strongly. And there are some people who are critical of Moon Jae-in's administration, some timidity in this area. Now, today, actually, the ruling party in South Korea came up with a statement that says that they actually propose to reopening of casing industrial relations so that they can make the mask, face mask in this combating the coronavirus 19. And I think it's a realistic possibility, and let's hope that what it leads to. I think the more important question here is, again, the Kim Hong-gil, who is the son of former President Kim Dae-jung, like President Kim Dae-jung, who is in charge of inter-Korean, with his organization dealing with North Korea. He said that there's going to be some major inter-Korean jumpstart of inter-Korean engagement. So we will. I think I'm very hopeful. Maybe this one. It's unexpected, but maybe this can lead to the resumption of a casing industrial complex. And also all those small business owners of a casing industrial complex who have hurt greatly. And they have, not only the peace activists, they have mobilized and they really have been pushing for the reopening of a casing industrial complex, and which was, jewel of inter-Korean engagement. And, sadly, as you remember, they even came to Washington and tried to push for it, and then, they got a very cold response from the United States, which is really very unfortunate. But obviously this could be something that can, lead to the kind of a thawing or reopening of inter-Korean relationship.
Also, it seems to me that, there has been some flexibility shown by the Trump administration in helping in terms of humanitarian support for North Korea during this time of coronavirus. And that may open up, some ways for groups that have been working there to expand their work, possibly.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I would like to ask Tim, I am not sure exactly understand your presentation. You explained there is some different stance between military US and some other parties, CIA and its politicians in US, on keeping that sanction on North Korea. So could you explain a little bit more about what's really political gains of U.S. politicians keeping sanction on North Korea?
I think the Pentagon and the U.S. military, the issue of the sanctions isn't so important to them, but the issue of, their relationship with the South Korean military and the kind of so-called readiness of U.S. South Korean forces. And so, like the U.S. commanders in South Korea, have generally been, very supportive of stopping the military, postponing, scaling down the military exercises that they do with South Korea as a way to create a better atmosphere for negotiations and diplomacy. And they've been pretty strong on that, which I think is worthy of notice because that's not always how our military is perceived, and not always how they act. So I think that because of they have this responsibility as an alliance partner. Along with the military alliance goes all kinds of things, and so there's changes going on between the U.S. and South Korea in this military alliance. For example, there is quite a bit of there's been a lot of negotiations about restoring South Korean control over its military in time of war. This is called OPCON, or operational control, operational command, which means, like right now, if a war broke out between, with North Korea, if there's a war situation, the U.S. commander would become the leader of all the U.S. and South Korean forces in wartime. And, South Korea for some time has wanted to have a South Korean general in charge, during wartime, because it's a very unusual situation. And these negotiations have been going on, but they've been complicated by, the Trump administration's kind of nationalistic demands on South Korea and seeing South Korea more like, you owe us, we're there because you should be paying us more, and almost acting like the US is some kind of mercenary force that Korea should pay to support them. And, I think this grates at the military, US military, like they don't see themselves that way. And I think some of the hardliners that, really want to be tough on North Korea also feel that way of treating South Korea is not right for alliances. And so, that's where I think there's some differences. And so, when people start talking about more like militaristic forces start talking about a regime change in North Korea and somehow aiding forces that would overthrow the Korean government, that would lead to war. And so the US military is very wary of another war in Korea. The US military knows, one of the biggest defeats ever suffered by the US Marines was in North Korea during the Korean War, when the US Marines, 2 divisions were sent, they actually, after they pushed North Korean soldiers out of South Korea, the US and US-led UN forces went into North Korea, and they went almost all the way to China, to the river, Yalu River. And then the Chinese forces, as we all know, came down, and the Chinese forces surrounded the US Marines, and that was a terrible defeat for the US Marines. Hundreds and hundreds of US Marines died, and they just, finally made it out by the skin of their teeth, this famous withdrawal that they did that winter of 1950. So in the US military, lots of generals, and they know this history, and they know, the conditions of Korea during winters and what a terrible war it would be. So, I think it's more of it's some of the differences over, the military generals and people who have been in service for a long time, people who have served in Korea particularly, and American military personnel, when you go to Korea, it really does good for your career, right? You always see top US military officials, they've always served in Korea at some point. So they understand how destructive war can be and how destructive a future war would be. And so that's why I think they're very, very careful. And often when, conservatives here criticize Trump for, not only conservatives, but many Democrats criticize Trump for stopping military exercises with South Korea. The U.S. military tends to be very supportive of that because, their purpose there is supposedly to, defend the armistice and make sure that the armistice doesn't break out into a war. And so negotiations are a way to do that. So I think there's some, it's sort of a difference in their purpose. And so they, regime change or, some kind of, subversion of North Korea by, CIA forces or something like that would really push tensions to a high level. And that's what, I don't think the US military wants that at all. They want to maintain bases in Asia to be sort of deterrent against China as they see it. But they don't want a war in Korea. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. One more, it's a little bit some silly question is why the regime changing of North Korea is very important to the US. How do you think about that?
What's the question again?
Why the regime changing of North Korea why is important?
Well, I think there's certain forces here that would just like to see a united Korea under, pro-US Korea that would be, they'd overthrow somehow there'd be an overthrow of the North Korean government, of the Kim family, and that it would be replaced by some kind of.
You mean to still influence the communist ideology to US or?
Yeah, like it would be, some kind of, united Korea under, South Korean and the pro-US Korea. But, obviously that's something that the Chinese don't want to have US forces, US troops up on the Yalu again. And so, but I think there are some people here, you see them, I hear people talk from the RAND Corporation and some of these hardline think tanks, and they talk in terms of like, well, maybe there could be some kind of, counterinsurgency or, a war of insurgency against the North Korean regime. And I don't see any chance for that at all. I don't see any kind of cracks like that. Any kind of like big popular uprising like there was like in Eastern Europe at certain times at the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, I think
I don't think that's happening
as well. Thank you. Thank you. I see.
린다모님 질문인데요.
네.
한국에 있는 유엔사가 한국과 북한과의 관계에서 거의 모든 민간 교류까지도 발목을 잡고 있는데 유엔사 해체나 유엔사 철수에 대해서는 어떻게 생각하는가요?
So this was the question about, the Linda asked about the state of UNC, UN Command. And as a team pointed out that, UNC is basically, although it's under United Nations command, it is mostly controlled by United States. And one thing, for instance, like the DMZ, who has the control of the demilitarized zone, is not really South Korea. It's yet to South Korea actually get a permission from UNC, and that also, even for the last year and a half, there is some issues regarding that, and there is an obstacle, and. This is an archaic command, and there has strong movement to disband United Nations command. In fact, this is they even came all the way to Washington D.C. and they tried to raise awareness. And I think the problem, on the other hand, if you look at the other side. People who are against the disbanding the UNC is that because we are still in the under armistices and we do not have a peace treaty yet. So at this point, if you do not disband the UNC, what's going to happen? So that seems to be at least one concern that to want to have maintained the current status quo. But I personally think the UNC should be. As the way it is organized, because it's complete under the more under the Americans, United States control, and I think it has to be transformed, if not completely disbanded. And that is my personal view, and I think there's a strong movement about that, and I think there's a merit to that argument. So so let's see what if the team has anything more insight on that.
Well, like I said before, I think the UN command has a certain role in some of the steps that are being taken that involve North and South Korean, not behavior, but what they do at the border and the stationing of their forces and that kind of thing, because that is all under the UN command. And so when there is a lessening of tensions and a deliberate move to, like remove landmines or take down guard posts like they did, the UN command has to be involved. And in that sense, convening that meeting and working out the details of how North and South Korea did that was very important. But, at some point, if there's a peace treaty, there's not going to be any need for a UN command in Korea. And there's not going to, the position of U.S. military forces will be very much a negotiating point between South and North Korea. And in fact, a lot of conservatives here in the United States say that, North Korea's aim is to, use its nuclear weapons as leverage to force South Korea to accede to North Korean control over all of Korea, and to kick U.S. forces out. In fact, in negotiations in the past, North Korea has made it clear to U.S. negotiators as well as South Korean negotiators that they might be able to accept U.S. forces being in Korea for a certain amount of time, even after a peace agreement. And there's even been talk sometimes that they see U.S. military as a bit of a hedge against China, even, You know, and it's unclear, you know, where their position is on that now. But I think clearly, once there's a peace treaty, that you know, there's no more armistice. The UN command is there to have oversight over the armistice, and the armistice itself, you know, can be changed in many ways. Like the purpose of that armistice, I mean, the purpose of the UN command could be, you know, could be very different after an armistice. But I think, I mean, I agree with Simone. There's no reason for that to continue once there is some kind of peace agreement. And you know, and eventually, I think it's going to be up to the South Korean people, you know, a very democratic country, whether they want to have U.S. forces there anymore. And then, you know, that I see that as a question that is up to the Korean people. I think eventually that could happen, a withdrawal of U.S. forces.
Actually, I just want to point out three things that the people who want to raise awareness on this, they said, I'm just reading from their literature, they said, how can the UN command contribute to engagement for peace on the Korean Peninsula? A, call on all UN command member countries to support the two Koreas in their bid to secure the Korean Peninsula by themselves and determine their own future. Second, call on all UN command member countries to withdraw from the UN command. Third, support the growing international call to end the Korean War and realize a peace treaty for lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula. So this may be one way to we can contextualize the question.
Let me read the H.K. Chun's last question. She said, North Korea test fire to short-range missile. What North Korea wants is lifting sanctions. This is North Korea's first weapon test since last November. U.S. leads sanctions and the maximum pressure has failed to stop North Korea test and the nuclear advance. So North Korea's healthcare system is weak because of the sanctions. U.S. and South Korea need to be creative by responding to current pandemic. What is your solution to move forward?
You know, it is true that they tested some short-range missiles recently, and they tested quite a few last year. These are not ICBMs. These are not long-range missiles that can hit North America. These are short-range missiles that they see as part of their natural defense against the forces that are arrayed against them, namely U.S. forces in Japan, Okinawa, South Korea, Guam. And so, you know, when they, you know, so these missiles they have, like, you know, if there's a war, they want to defend themselves, right? So who is in the war, who would they face? Well, in the Korean War, you know, U.S. forces in Korea would be augmented by U.S. forces in Japan. And the bases in Japan serve as, you know, bombing bases and all, you know, all kinds of, you know, surveillance bases and so on. So, you know, they see it as their defense, you know, building their own defense capabilities. And, you know, while it's true that they're testing this, the United States is also, you know, building up its own nuclear capabilities. I mean, you know, you have to remember that Trump walked out of the, you know, intermediate nuclear force, you know, this treaty that they signed with the Soviets a long time ago, and they quit that. Now the U.S. is testing new kinds of nuclear weapons, and some of them involve like short, not real long ICBM, but, you know, shorter range kind of rockets that can, you know, that could be, say, stationed in Guam and would be able to hit Pyongyang or hit Beijing. The U.S. is starting to test those kind of launch vehicles. And so that's kind of an escalation too. But, you know, to me, the only thing that's going to resolve that is to have, you know, an arms agreement, you know, negotiation between the U.S. and DPRK, and also involving, you know, South Korea and, you know, eventually other countries in the region that have military. So, you know, I think what's in terms of a step that could be taken, I would see recognizing that the tests that they do, and I think actually, you know, the U.S. military is not, if you notice, they're not terribly alarmed about these tests. They don't see them as a strategic advance over what they had before, like nuclear weapons are, or like long-range missiles are. It's their own defensive capabilities that they're protecting. And, you know, U.S. military and South Korean military are also very well aware that, you know, the South Korean military is far, far larger and more powerful than the North Korean military. So, you know, for North Korea, it doesn't have a, you know, huge, there's no foreign soldiers in North Korea. It has alliances with China, but it doesn't have a massive, you know, military relationship with China at all. So they're doing this on their own.
I think another scenario, more, you know, that's actually even some conservative analysts pointed out that maybe just accept North Korea as a de facto nuclear weapon state, and as long as they don't test any more nukes or ICBM, and so that means that will lead to, instead of complete denuclearization that the United States has sought, it will be more gradual process. So first, it will be more arms control phase, then enter into more prolonged step by process of denuclearization. As you know, denuclearization even if we start right now today, it will take, experts argue that it will take 20, 30 years. So that in itself would require diplomacy. So I think that that's another, at least a more realistic possibility when we can get out of this than you know, yeah, let's go to, yeah, the de facto, North Korea's de facto nuclear weapon state, and then the next movement will be arms control. But the question is, as the analysts point out, whether South Korea, Japan, will be able to accept such a state, and also many United States, will they accept that kind of status quo? And moreover, under that scenario, the North Korea will be still under the sanctions, right? So how can North Korea sustain that? So that's another question. And going back to the what to do, I still stick to my idea, the how to get out of this impasse. Open the liaison offices in Washington and Pyongyang, the first step, and to moving toward this partial lifting part the sanctions. And I think those are realistic possible options that we should see.
Thanks for the wonderful presentation. Could the United States and the United Nations lift some of the economic sanctions on North Korea to enable them to deal with the coronavirus? This would be a concrete sign that we are interested in improving relations, and really a critical time. I understand this has happened with Iran, and perhaps it could happen with North Korea as well.
I could say it could happen, and in that sense, I think that will probably require some kind of more activist work as well. But the problem right now is that we do not know very well, because North Korea is not totally transparent. We do not have all the data about this, the state of the coronavirus in North Korea, the spread of this virus. So I think, so therefore, even to get the, what's happening in South Korea right now, we know it's a very open society, all the data is available, and even like a minute by minute. So for that reason, I think it's really important to really jumpstart the engagement with North Korea, and under this sort of umbrella of addressing humanitarian and also major public health issue. And I really see that there is a great opportunity here, and maybe probably this is something nobody we didn't really predict about this, this public health issue. Probably this is really, sees opportunity and really push for the engagement, not only with the United States and North Korea, and also, but also involve the UN level and the inter-Korean relationship.
I mean, I think it would be a terrific step, and I think they've made some public statements about it on the U.S. side, but I'm not sure if anything concrete has actually been, message has been passed to the DPRK about this. Or and then I have not seen any kind of formal statement from the State Department. the U.S. government saying that they would favor lifting some sanctions to allow, humanitarian relief to come into North Korea over this. But I know it's definitely being talked about, but it's unclear how far they're pushing it. But it'd certainly be, I actually think, in terms of sanctions, the UN sanctions, the ones that were imposed in '87 that hit their like trade in oil, like I was saying, and coal and that kind of thing, these basic commodities. I mean, they were imposed when North Korea was, tested a nuclear weapon and also was testing these long-range ICBMs that could hit North America, long range, and they stopped doing that. They have not tested those at all. And it seems to me that there should be a recognition that they have, stopped those testing for almost, 2.5 years now. And then maybe it's time that there could be a unilateral lifting of these sanctions because they have not, tested those weapons since then. And that would be something. I mean, I know that the Chinese government and the Russian government have had proposals to the UN Security Council about changing the sanctions and lifting some of the sanctions, but I'm not sure how strong of a diplomatic offensive they're making because of that proposal has not gone very far. But I think there's got to be, I really think that there's got to be some outside country has got to step in and help. Some leader from some country might really make a difference in getting things moving here.
And also, I'll add also, it's also not that many experts already pointed out that, sanctions, a lot of sanctions are, enacted mainly for domestic political purposes in the United States, Sanctions, sanctions really don't work. So it's really failure. It's really failed. So I think in this is going, supporting what Tim says here. Maybe it's just the United States can unilaterally lift some of those sanctions. That's just created in the political purpose, and maybe it could be a good breakthrough. And I also want to one anecdote that I had personally. I participated Korea Ethics Days in this second one, and I was just shocked and amazed how little that those people in who the congressional staff, right, aides to senators and members of the House, who are in the helping writing the bill about the sanctions. They never even met one single North Korean. They didn't know much about North Korea, but they were involved in writing, right, the bill about sanctions on North Korea. And in fact, when I went to visit them with American doctor who have been visiting North Korea every year, and when he talked about all this story, they were truly shocked and impressed. And I came up with, oh my God, these guys who don't know anything about North Korea, the first time they saw anybody who even went to North Korea is writing the bill about sanctions against North Korea. It was truly a revealing. So anyway, yeah. Well,
the last thing about the sanctions is that clearly they have not deterred North Korea from building nuclear weapons or, building very, very sophisticated missiles. I mean, they've had sanctions imposed on them for years and years, but that has not stopped them, and it's not been an effective weapon. And now it seems to be mostly, just really hurting ordinary people and not sort of backfiring in that sense. So, I mean, I just don't think they're very effective.
I think we have to finish because it's more than 1 hour. So I really appreciate Simone and the team for our lecture and the question and answers. So thank you for everyone for joining JNC TV first webinar, and hope to see you next time. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very
much. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
더 나은 세상을 위해 공정한 언론의 역할을 다하고자 노력하는 JNC-TV는 전 제작진의 자발적인 참여로 만들어지는 독립 언론이자 대한 매체입니다. 방송이 마음에 드셨다면 응원의 표시로 지금 좋아요, 구독 버튼을 눌러주세요. 감사합니다.